"Oh, Blob!" came a shout from behind them. "Just keep walking," said Bob. Joe turned around to look and glimpsed a pair of twins. They looked terrifying, like gorillas in human suits. These must be the dreadful Grubbs Bob had talked about. "Don't look around," said Bob. "I'm serious. Just keep walking." Joe was beginning to wish he was luxuriating in the safety of his back seat of the chauffeur-driven Rolls-Royce rather than walking to the bus stop. "Fatso!" As Joe and Bob walked faster, they could hear footsteps behind them. Although it was still early, the winter sky was blackening. The street lamps flickered on, and blotches of yellow light spilled onto the wet ground. "Quick, let's run down here," said Bob. The boys dashed down an alley and hid behind a giant green wheelie bin that was parked at the back of Bella Pasta. "I think we lost them," whispered Bob. "Are those the Grubbs?" asked Joe. "Shh! Keep your voice down." "Sorry," whispered Joe. "Yeah, it's the Grubbs." "The ones who bully you?" "That's them. They're identical twins. Dave and Sue Grubb." "Sue? One of them's a girl?" Joe could swear that when he turned around and seen the twins following them, both of them had thick facial hair. "Sue's a girl, yes," said Bob, as if Joe was some kind of idiot. "Then they can't be identical," whispered Joe. "I mean, if one's a boy and one's a girl." "Well, yes, but no one can tell them apart." Suddenly Joe and Bob heard footsteps coming closer and closer. "I can smell fat boys," came a voice from the other side of the bin. The Grubbs wheeled him away to reveal the two boys crouching behind it. Joe took his first good look at the pair. Bob was right. The Grubbs were identical. They both had matching crew cuts, hairy knuckles and moustaches, all of which seemed unfortunate for both of them. "Let's play Spot the Difference with Grubbs. Can you spot any difference between these two?" "No, you can't. They are exactly the same." A gust of cold wind hummed through the alley. An empty can trundled past on the ground. Something twitched in the bushes. "How was the cross-country run without your kit today, Blob?" chuckled one Grubb. "I knew that was you two," Bob replied angrily. "So what did you do with it?" "It's in the canal," chuckled the other. "Now give us your chocolate." Even hearing these voices that didn't give any clues as to who was Dave and who was Sue, both their voices wavered high and low in one sentence. "I'm taking some home for my mum," protested Bob. "I don't care," said the other Grubb. "Give it to us, you little..." said the other one. I have to confess, reader, that the bit was a swear word. If you don't know any swear words, it's best to ask a parent or a teacher. For example, there are some very rude words that I know. All of these words are so rude, I wouldn't dream of putting them in this book. "Don't pick on him," said Joe. Then he instantly regretted drawing attention to himself again as the Grubbs took a step towards him. "Or what?" said either Dave or Sue, their breath toxic from a bag of skips they had recently snatched from a little girl in year 5. "Or..." Joe searched his mind for something to say that would crush these bullies forever. "Or, I'll be very disappointed in both of you." That wasn't it. The Grubbs laughed. They snatched what was left of the Cadbury's Dairy Milk bar from Bob's hand and then grabbed his arms. They lifted him up, and as Bob yelled for help, they deposited him into the wheelie bin. Before Joe could say anything else, the Grubbs were stomping off down the road laughing, with their mouths full of stolen chocolate. Joe dragged a wooden crate over, then stood on it to give himself more height. He leaned down into the bin and caught hold of Bob under the armpits. With a great heave, he started to pull his friend out of the bin. "Are you okay?" he asked, as he strained to take Bob's weight. "Oh, yeah, they do this to me most days," said Bob. He pulled some spaghetti and Parmesan cheese out of his curly hair. Some of it might have been there since the last time the Grubb twins deposited him in a bin. "Well, why don't you tell your mum?" "I don't want her to make her worry about me. She's got enough to worry about already, replied Bob. Maybe you should tell a teacher then. The Grubbs said if I ever told anyone that they would really beat me up. They know where I live, and even if they got expelled, they could still find me, said Bob. He looked like he was about to cry. Joe didn't like to see his new friend upset. One day, I'll get them back. I will. My dad always used to say the best way to beat bullies is to stand up to them. One day, I will. Joe looked at his new friend, standing there in his underwear, covered in scraps of Italian food. He thought of Bob standing up to the Grubbs. The fat boy would get massacred. But maybe there's another way, he thought. Maybe I can get the Grubbs off his back forever. He smiled. He still felt bad about paying Bob to come last in the race. Now he could make up for it. If his plan worked, he and Bob were going to be more than just friends. They'd be best friends. I bought you something, said Joe. He and Bob were sitting on the bench in the playground, watching the more agile kids play football. Just because you're a billionaire doesn't mean you have to buy me anything, said Bob. I know, but Joe brought a large bar of dairy milk out of his bag. Bob's eyes couldn't help but light up a little. We can share it, said Joe, before snapping off a tiny square of chocolate, then breaking that tiny square in half. Bob's face fell. I'm only joking, said Joe. Here. He handed Bob the bar to help himself. Oh no, said Bob. What? Asked Joe. Bob pointed. The Grubbs were walking slowly across the playground towards them, right through the games of football. Not that anyone dared to complain. Quick, let's make a run for it, said Bob. Where? The dining room. They wouldn't dare go in there. No one does. Why? You'll see. When they burst into the dining room, it was completely empty, aside from a lone diner lady. The Grubbs burst in a few paces behind them, their genders still uncertain. If you aren't eating, get out, shouted Mrs. Trafe. But, Mrs. Trafe, said either Dave or Sue. I said out. The twins reluctantly retreated as Joe and Bob tentatively made their way to the serving counter. Mrs. Trafe was a large, smiley soul of dinner lady age. Bob had explained on the way to the canteen that she was nice enough, but her food was truly revolting. The kids in the school would rather die than eat anything she cooked. In fact, they probably would die if they ate anything she cooked. Who's that then? Said Mrs. Trafe, peering at Joe. This is my friend Joe, said Bob. Despite the vile smell in the canteen, Joe felt warmth spread through him. No one had ever called him his friend before. Now, what would you like today, boys? Mrs. Trafe said with a warm smile. I have very nice badger and onion pie, some deep-fried rust, or for the vegetarians, I have jacket potatoes with sock cheese. It all looks so nice, said Bob, lying, as the Grubbs stared in at them through the grimy windows. Mrs. Trafe's cooking was truly unspeakable. A typical week's menu for the school canteen looked like this. Soup of the day, wasp, gerbils on toast, hare lasagna, all served with deep-fried cardboard, and dessert, a slice of sweat cake. It's so hard to choose, said Bob, desperately scouring the trays of food for something edible. I think we will just have 2 jacket potatoes, please. Is there any chance I could have it without sock cheese? Pleaded Joe. Bob looked hopefully at Mrs. Trafe. I could sprinkle on some earwax shavings, if you prefer, or a showering of dandruff, offered Mrs. Trafe with a smile. I think I'll have it totally plain, please, said Joe. Some boiled mold on the side, perhaps. You are growing boys, offered Mrs. Trafe, wielding a serving spoon of something green and unspeakable. I'm on diet, Mrs. Trafe, said Joe. Me too, said Bob. That's a shame, boys, said the dinner lady dolefully. I have a smashing dessert on today. Jellyfish and custard. My absolute favourite too, said Joe. Never mind. He took his tray to one of the empty tables and sat down. As he put his knife and fork into the potato, he realized that Mrs. Trafe had forgotten to cook it. "How are your spuds?" called Mrs. Trafe across the hall. "Delicious, thank you, Mrs. Trafe," Joe called back as he pushed his raw potato around the plate. It was still covered in soil, and he noticed a maggot burrowing out of it. "I hate it when they're too well done. This is perfect." Good, good, she said. Bob was trying to chew his, but it was so utterly inedible he started crying. "Something the matter, boy?" said Mrs. Trafe. "Oh no, it's so delicious that these are tears of joy." Bring! Once again, that wasn't your doorbell, readers. That was the bell to signal the end of lunch. Joe let out a sigh of relief. Dinner hour was over. "Oh, what a shame," Mrs. Trafe said. "Joe, we have to go to our maths lesson now." Mrs. Trafe limped over and inspected their plates. "You've hardly touched them," she said. "Sorry. It was just so filling and really, really tasty though," said Joe. Seconded Bob, still crying. "Well, it doesn't matter. I can put them in the fridge for you and you can finish them off tomorrow." Joe and Bob shared a horrified look. "Really, I don't want you to go to any trouble," said Joe. "No trouble at all. See you then. And I've got some specials tomorrow. It's the anniversary of the bombing of Pearl Harbor, so it's Japanese Day. I'm doing my armpit hair sushi, followed by tadpole tempura. Boys? Boys!" "I think the Grubbs have gone," said Bob, as they sneaked out of the canteen. "I've just got to use the toilet." "I'll wait for you," said Joe. He leaned against the wall as Bob disappeared through a door. Usually Joe would have said that toilets were smelly, and he would have been horrified to use them after the privacy of his own ensuite bathroom with the Empress-sized bath. But the truth was that the toilets didn't smell as bad as the canteen did. Suddenly, Joe sensed two figures looming behind him. He didn't need to turn round. He knew it was the Grubbs. "Where is he?" said one. "He's in the boys' toilet, but you can't go in there," said Joe. "Well, not both of you anyway." "Where's the chocolate bar?" asked the other. "Bob's got it," said Joe. "Well, we'll wait for him then," said the Grubbs. The other Grub turned to Joe, a deadly look in its eye. "Now, give us $1, unless you want a dead arm, that is." Joe gulped. I'm glad I bumped into you two guys. Well, guy and a girl, obviously." "Obviously," said Dave or Sue. "Give us $1. "Wait," said Joe. "It's just, I wondered if—" "Give him a dead arm, Sue," said a Grub, revealing for perhaps the first time which one of the twins was male and which one was female. But then the Grubs grabbed Joe and spun him around, and he lost track again. "No, wait," said Joe. "The thing is, I want to make the two of you an offer."